Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the seminar. We have today Susan Dynarski. She came already in March, so thank you so much for being here again at the Ministry of Education in Spain. Susan Dynarski is a professor of public policy, education and economics at the University of Michigan, where she holds appointment at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy, School of Education and Department of Economics. She earned the master's degree at Harvard University, and she got her PhD at the MIT. So she has published a lot of papers on the education field, economics of education, papers who are published in very top research journals such as American Economic Review. So she has testified about education and tax policy before the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, the U.S. House Ways and Means Committee, and the President's Commission on Tax Reform. Thank you so much, Susan. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me back again. The paper, what I'm going to talk about today, is a little different from what I did in March. So in March, I presented one paper about one topic. Today, I am going to be talking about entire literature that addresses financial aid policy and post-secondary finance. So I will be talking about broad lessons that come from that literature, and I hope they will have some resonance for policy questions that you're facing as well. They, of course, come from a very specific context, the U.S. post-secondary system, and so I'll give some background on that so you'll understand the setting in which these policies are operating. This is joint work with Judith Scott Clayton. She was my very first doctoral student, and now she's a professor at Columbia University, and we've been collaborating for many years. All right, so as I said, I'm first going to talk about a bit about the higher education structure in the U.S. because the peculiarities of that explain why we have some of the finance structures that we do. I'll be talking about sticker price versus net price. So in the United States, the sticker price is the price you hear about, that the very high tuition costs. Most people face a discounted price. They've gotten some sort of discount on their tuition costs, so I'll make that distinction. And then talk about evidence on the effect of price. So the focus of the talk is going to be, what is the effect of changing costs for post-secondary education on educational outcomes? So that's the question that I'm addressing. All right, so first of all, in the U.S., about 80% of undergraduate students attend public institutions. And our public institutions are run by our states. They're not run by the federal government. They're run by the states. About 10% attend, so that would be University of Michigan, University of Virginia, Berkeley, as well as many others. So those are some of the most prominent, but the public sector also includes technical training institutions, community colleges, as well as the great research universities. 10% of students attend private schools that are not-for-profit institutions. So Columbia is an example, Harvard University is an example. And then increasingly, we have students also attending for-profit institutions. So these, 10 years ago, only 2% of students were attending these schools. These schools have been around for a long time, but especially during the last recession, when there was enormous demand for schooling because the labor market was in such terrible shape, the public sector couldn't absorb all the students, and we saw a lot of growth in the for-profit sector. Okay, so the public sector, as I said, that's 80% of undergraduates. It's broken roughly into 4-year institutions that offer the BA, and then what we call community colleges. These are the 2-year technical institutions, and they offer a degree called the AA. Then the private nonprofit is universities and colleges, the 4-year institutions. The for-profits tend to be 1- or 2-year institutions. So they tend to provide very practical training Some of them offer a BA, but most of them offer training in computer management and radiology and X-ray therapy, that sort of thing. Now, the funding. In the public sector, as I said, the states run the public schools. And the way it works is that the states give money to the schools, which then charge very low tuition because they're being subsidized by the state. They can therefore charge low tuition. The nonprofits charge high tuitions. They're not being supported by the state, so some of them, like say Harvard, have very large bank accounts. So Harvard is second only to the Catholic Church as a nonprofit in terms of the amount of money that it holds worldwide. Harvard's right up there. Some give great discounts off of their sticker prices for some students. And the for-profits, they're for-profits. They charge quite high prices, right? So, you know, it's not clear that costs are any different here. So distinguish between costs and prices. Prices are what the students pay. Costs are how much it costs to give the education, to create the education. It's not clear that these schools cost more to create a given education. It's just that the prices that the students face are not subsidized in the way that they are at the public institutions. So tuition in the US has been rising quite a bit. So this goes back 30 years, and this is adjusted for inflation using, you know, the CPI, our standard inflation adjustment. So these trends that you see are net of inflation. These are increases in real prices. So here, as I mentioned, the public institutions, the 2 years especially, quite low price, right? So, you know, $1,000 a year for attending these institutions. And they've gone up. You know, the 2 years are also quite low, about $2,000 back in 1981. Rapid rate of growth, but the level is quite low compared to, this is what gets a lot of attention, is the prices at the private institutions have risen quite a bit. So $30,000 annually in tuition and fees. And this does not include the cost of living, of, you know, a dormitory, food, rent, that sort of thing. This is just the cost of attending the school. All right. The prices at our public institutions, so I showed you this here. It's been going up over time. This has been going up because the state has been giving less and less money to the schools. You might be familiar with this here. I think everywhere in the world is familiar with this, unfortunately. So if you're going to keep teaching and you're getting less money from the state, the money has to come from somewhere, and it comes from the students. So the tuition has gone up as a result. This just sort of makes clear, this blue line is state funding per student, and we're looking at the percent change in that. So, you know, when funding for the students, for the colleges goes down, tuition goes up. Right? It's just sort of a mirror image. And over here, in particular, is a steep increase and a steep decrease and a steep increase. So there's nothing mysterious here about why prices are going up in the public sector. It's because the state is giving less money to the schools. All right. So all of that was about what I'm going to call sticker price. So sticker price, this analogy comes from buying a car. So when you go to buy a car, it's got a sticker on it that says how much the car costs, but nobody pays that price. You bargain. Right? You bargain with the car dealer, and same idea here. There's a bit less bargaining, but the idea is there's a sticker price, and then there's how much you actually pay for the school. And that's going to be net price. Okay, so, you know, if you take those sticker prices that I just showed you, you would, to get the net price, you would subtract from it any grants that the student gets. And the federal government is one of the largest sources of grants for students. So the federal government has a voucher program, essentially, called the Pell Grant, where low-income students if they have about less than median income, they can get a grant that they can take to any post-secondary institution in the country. So we have multiple levels of government. You have the states running the schools, but then the federal government is providing scholarships. Some of the schools themselves will offer a scholarship. So they'll say, okay, here's what it costs, but here's a discount for you. Then there's loans, of course. We're not going to subtract that from the price because you have to pay back a loan. But they're increasingly important in the U.S. as a method for funding college education. So if you went back 40 years, you would see that grants and subsidies from the states funded most post-secondary costs, but now loans play a very important role. And then another source of funding is increasingly we're using the tax system, the federal tax system, to subsidize people going to college. So people will get a break on their income taxes if their child's in college, for example. And this is now as large as these grants were, say, 10 years ago. So this is about $19 billion a year at this point. All right, so just to give you a sense of how much aid, when I say aid, this is grants and loans, I believe. So this line is total enrollment. So, about 14 million people in college a few years ago. And then aid per student is around $12,000. Okay, so, from all the different funding sources put together that I just listed, this is what it looks like. All right, so the federal government is the main source of student-based aid. The states give money to the schools to fund the schools directly. The federal government gives money to the students. And it's about $180 billion for about 20 million students. The figure I showed before, the 14 million, was full-time equivalent. We have a lot of part-time students, so there are more students than there are full-time equivalent students. Of this 180 billion, about 80 billion is in the form of grants. And then the balance in the form of loans. 35 billion in these Pell Grants, right? 19 billion for the tax credits. All right. So, and here's the overall trends in the different components. There's a lot going on here, but the basic idea here is that the blue is grants, and this yellow and orange stuff is mostly loans. So you can sort of see that the role of loans has been getting bigger and bigger. All right, so this is the same graph that I showed you before, different color, but remember I showed you the private tuition prices going up, the much lower public. This now superimposes on it the net price. So that was the sticker price, now you can see the net price, and you can see it's considerably lower. In fact, if you, can I make a little, ooh, all right. If you look here, so once you count up all of the grants and tax credits and so forth that people get, a person attending one of the two-year colleges is paying nothing and in fact has some money to use for living expenses. Right? That's why it's going negative here, that they've got some extra money for books and so forth. At the four-year institutions, they still have some costs left after the grant funds are in place. And here, this big gap here, there are a lot of discounts that these schools provide their students. Okay, so as you can see, there's different ways that price could potentially affect behavior in this market. There's the sticker price, there's the net price, there are changes in grants, changes in loans, and I'll be giving evidence on each of these different questions. But when you ask in post-secondary education, does money matter? The answer in part is it depends. What form does the money take? Is the money taking the form of a grant for students? Is it taking the form of an interest rate subsidy? Right? When you offer a loan at below market rate, it costs something to do that. So that would be one way to spend money, for example. What effect does that have? All right. So let's get to looking at some estimates of the effective price on student decisions. And the decisions I'll be focusing on are going to college, persisting in college, getting a degree. All right. So the literature is very large on this question, and it varies enormously in quality. And what I'm going to talk about, the papers I'm going to focus on in this presentation, are ones that we're pretty confident are providing a causal estimate of the relationship between price and outcomes. So it is challenging to try to figure out what the effective price is, as it is in any market. So we want to know, we change the price, what would happen to the number of people who go to college, who finish college. So we might ask, if we provide a subsidy of $1,000 by changing tuition price or providing more aid, what happens to the level of education in the population? So this is obviously relevant for policy purposes. If you want to do a cost-benefit analysis, you need to know what the causal impact of this money is on behavior so you can figure out what you're getting for your money. So we might start out by running an equation that looks like this. And S can be some measure of schooling. So it might be a dummy variable that indicates you went to college or that you completed a degree. And aid is some measure of the amount of grant aid, say, that they're being offered. And you would like to know, if we manipulate aid, what happens to schooling. And if we want to understand what this equation would get us, we need to think about why aid is varying. So why is our key variable varying? So the aid that I talked about takes the form of need-based aid. This is the aid that goes to low-income students. If you looked only at, say, the Pell Grant, which is for low-income students, and you compared young people who were and were not eligible for the Pell Grant, and you looked at their educational outcomes, their college completion, for example, you would get a negative coefficient on aid. Because the people who are eligible for that grant are low income, tend to have poorer academic preparation, they're less likely to go to college, and what you're picking up is not the effect of the grant, but the underlying characteristics that are correlated with the grant. Okay, so if you just ran a naive regression of schooling on need-based aid, you would falsely get a negative estimate of the effect of aid on behavior. Some grants take the form of merit aid. Somebody gets very good grades in high school or scores high on a standardized test. They get additional scholarships. Well, if that was the source of aid you were estimating off of, you get a positive bias, right? Because somebody who's got very high test scores and very high grades is probably going to do well in college no matter what, and you would get too positive an estimate. Here's something that we have. I don't think, do you guys have athletic scholarships for college? Yeah, it's a crazy thing. So, we pay for the football players and the basketball players and so forth to go to college, and I'll let you imagine whether that would be a positive or a negative bias if we were to estimate that relationship. Okay, so lots of reasons why aid varies, and the bias you would get from a OLS estimate is not clear. So this is a solution to this would be a randomized trial. We have not had a large-scale randomized trial in the US, or even a small-scale randomized trial of loans. We've had some small trials of grants in the US. What I'm going to be talking about today is largely going to be coming from natural experiments. So regression discontinuity analysis, differences in differences, propensity score matching are the types of methods that I'll be that are used by the papers I'm focused on today. All right, so I'm going to start just to be self-serving. I'll start with my own paper. This was a quasi-experimental analysis. I was looking at a program that was eliminated. It was a very large program, and it was suddenly eliminated, which lets you do a before and after comparison of what happens to educational outcomes. And you can do a treatment and comparison group analysis as well, because only a subset of the population was eligible for this. So this program, it was called the Social Security Student Benefit Program. It paid stipends to the children of Social Security beneficiaries. Social Security is our retirement program. It's also for disabled people. And it's also for the families of deceased workers. So it's an income support program for these groups. And if you were a kid in a family that was getting these benefits, instead of aging out of the program at age 18, you could keep getting the money if you went to college. So it was an income support that continued if you went to college at age 18. If you didn't go to college, it would stop when you were 18. The family wouldn't get the money any longer. So if you put together everyone who's got a deceased parent, disabled parent, or retired parent, it was quite a few people. It was 1 in 10 college students when it was at its peak in 1981, and it was the second largest federal student grant program. It was second to the Pell Grant program only. It was pretty generous too, so it was big and it was generous. In nominal terms, in 1981, it was about $3,000 a year, which, if you inflate that up, that's closer to $6,000. Back then, tuition was a lot lower. Remember the graphs I showed you started in 1981, and tuition was much lower. So that was actually enough money to pay for public university tuition completely and to take a good chunk out of private university tuition as well. So it was a generous program. Okay, it was eliminated in 1981. We had a new president, Ronald Reagan, and he was intent on cutting Social Security in general, and this was something that was cut out of the program. So if you were not enrolled in college in May 1982, you would not be able to get the benefits. So they grandfathered in people who were there for a couple of years, but anybody newly entering wouldn't be able to get these benefits. And the spending dropped like a rock naturally. It went from $3.3 billion to $0.3 billion in just 2 years. This is what the spending looks like. Now, this is actually the number of beneficiaries, as you can see, drops down. This here is shrinking cohort size, but this is the elimination of the program. All right, so the setup that I'm going to use, and that is used in a bunch of the other studies I'll be talking about today, is going to be differences in differences. Very straightforward. These folks who graduated high school in 1982 and 1983, none of them could be eligible for the program, so they're the after group. The before group, some of them were eligible for the program. I'm going to be focusing on people whose father died while the person was a child. Right? So if your father had died, or your mother, but mostly it was due to father's benefits, these benefits were based on the earnings of the adult. So the fathers were more likely to have had earnings. If your father died when you were young, you were eligible for these benefits during this period. You weren't eligible during this period. Right? So if we see a drop between here and here, between the before and the after period, we could potentially attribute this to the program's elimination. But there were other things going on between 1979 and 1983, so we will use, I had it backwards, right? So this is the control group. This is the father deceased group. So this is the group that we might see the drop for. This is a comparison group. We want to sort of take account of the fact that different things were happening in 1982 versus in 1979. And so this is going to provide basically the counterfactual of what we would have expected to happen in any case during this period. And then the difference between these two differences is going to be our estimate of the program's effect. Okay? Tiny, tiny print. I'll move on. All right, so I'm going to run this equation, which is going to give us the differences in differences estimate. And that's what this is. So this is a linear probability model. So these estimates are saying that the elimination of the program, or the presence of the program rather, the program being in place increased college attendance 18 percentage points in the affected population. Basically what we saw during the period that this program was in place was that the children of deceased parents were just as likely to go to college as other children, even though, can't quite see it here, those who had deceased fathers had lower incomes, so $33,000 a year as opposed to $54,000 for those whose parents were alive. This was a disadvantaged group because who has fathers who die young? Poor kids, right? Mortality rates are, life expectancy is shorter for poor people, right? So disproportionately, the people who were eligible for this were poor and non-white, right? So if we go down and look at college attendance, during the period that this program was in place, 1979 to 81 for this sample. The people with deceased fathers actually were slightly more likely to go to college than their counterparts who had living parents, 56% versus 49%. If we go over to the period once the program was eliminated, it switched, it reversed. So went down to 36% for those who have a deceased parent versus 46% for those who had living parents. So it appears that this program played a compensatory function and basically brought the college going of these kids up to the level of their peers. Once the program was eliminated, it fell back to levels that you would expect for kids with income this low with these backgrounds. So I do, I throw in a lot of controls and poke at this a whole lot, but in the end, you end up with this quite large effect of 18 percentage points. How big is that? Well, the program was quite generous, right? So if you divide it by the dollars that it offered, it comes out to be that offering $1,000 to a child, a high school senior, increased the likelihood that that kid would go to college by about 3 to 4 percentage points. Okay, and increased completed schooling in total about 0.7 of a year, or per $1,000 about 1/6 of a year. As more context, in the U.S. we have overall a pretty high college attendance rate. About 67% of our young people go to college. That's not conditioning on anything. That's, if you just look at a birth cohort, about 67% go to college. Only about 28% get a degree. So our dropout rate is about 50%. So all of those who went to college did not actually graduate college. So that's why we don't see as large an increase in completed schooling as you'd expect, given that increase in college entry. All right, so take that study, and over the past 10 years, we've had more and more studies like that, using even better methods, using regression discontinuity, as I said, and we have a pretty good body of evidence at this point that we can use to draw some lessons about the relationship between cost of college and student decisions, and that's what I'm going to focus on now. All right, so lesson 1, brilliant, right? You need an economist to tell you money matters. For college entry. So the best evidence we have on financial aid is about the college entry margin, the decision to go to college or not. A very important margin, too, is completion. I said there's a dropout rate of 50%. We have much more evidence on the college entry margin than we do on the completion margin. So we've got a good number of well-designed studies that find that when prices go down, enrollment increases. The range is fairly tight, 3 to 5 percentage points per $1,000 in aid is what we've seen. We have much less evidence on the effect of aid on completion. So getting a degree, getting 2 years of schooling instead of 1, the evidence is much thinner. Lesson 2. So remember that very long discussion of the structure of post-secondary finance. You've probably forgotten half of what I said. Think of an 18-year-old trying to figure it out, right? So our system is quite complicated. And the evidence we've got indicates that this undermines the effectiveness of the programs, right? So, you could have $38 billion in one simple streamlined program that's easy to explain to families and students, or you can do what we've done and break it up into dozens of programs that are very difficult to explain to families and students. So there is widespread misinformation among young people and their families about the actual cost of college. So they tend to overestimate the price of college, and the degree to which they overestimate it increases the poorer the family becomes. So well-off families have a good sense of how much college costs. Poorer families who are eligible for the most aid are the ones who are least likely to know about the aid. So if you don't know about a discount, you can't respond to it, right? So that's pretty straightforward. there was a randomized trial in which people were assisted in filling out the financial aid application for college, and the result were quite large increases in college attendance and persistence. And as a result of this, there are efforts underway. There's legislation in Congress right now. Whether it'll get out is not clear, but there are efforts underway to try to simplify and streamline the programs based on this evidence. This is just to give you a sense. This is what people have to fill out in the US to get all the grant programs that I listed. So that's the first page, second page, right? Oh, lovely, huh? Right, so when they basically did this for people, there's 127 questions on this. So when they did it for people, that's when it had a big impact of simplifying it. So complexity matters. Reducing it seems to help the effectiveness of programs. Third lesson, putting some strings on the money, some conditions on the money, seems to increase its effectiveness. So you could just say, here's $1,000, go to school, see you later. Or you could say, here's $1,000 if you get a 3.0 and you take at least 4 classes a semester, I'll give you another $1,000 next year. Right? So those are conditional programs. You can think of them as like conditional cash transfer programs, which are increasingly popular in development programs. So the evidence on the conditional aid programs, and there actually have been some randomized trials, small randomized trials on conditional aid programs, indicates that they do have an impact on college persistence and completion. And this is the only place actually we have good evidence on the effective aid on persistence and completion is from these conditional aid programs. It's not clear if these programs increase completion and persistence because they actually provide an incentive, you know, to spur on this behavior, or if it's because it just signals what's an appropriate level of behavior, right? So what do you need to do if you want to graduate in 4 years? So this, again, is a peculiarity of the US system. Our colleges are very unstructured. So many of the colleges that especially low-income kids go to have very little guidance about how many classes you should take, in what order you should take them, and these scholarship programs may basically send a signal of, if you want to get out of school in 2 years or 4 years, take this many courses, and if you want to succeed, you should get this kind of grade. Right? So it provides information as well as an incentive. Fourth lesson, and I'm getting to the end here, so you better have questions. Fourth lesson is that we don't know enough about loans. So I showed you that spending on grants has been going as a decreasing share of funding for college. Loans we're increasingly reliant on. So the big number that you hear about in the US is $1 trillion in student loans. About half of students borrow. People who go to university leave college with loan debt of around $25,000, which, given the payoff to college in the US, is not a huge amount of money. But given how reliant our system is on loans, we have very little evidence of their effectiveness. So to what extent do they actually get more people into college? So students don't like them. They'd rather get $1 and not have to pay it back than get $1 and have to pay it back, right? That's kind of obvious. The evidence we have indicates that $1 in loans is not as effective as $1 in grants, but that's not actually the relevant comparison, right? What you need, they're cheaper for the government to give out, right? Because 70% of it's going to be paid back. Part of it gets forgiven, doesn't get paid back. So the big question that's still open is whether they are as cost-effective as grants. You know, you could run into a situation where so many people are not paying their loans that you'd actually be better off and it'd be cheaper to give out grants in the first place, right? So it's still an open question. Most of the discussion in the US and the policy arena is around the interest rate on the loans, and people pushing to have them lower. I and others have been trying to shift the policy conversation towards how people repay loans in the U.S. So in Australia, in the United Kingdom, people pay back their loans as a percentage of their earnings. So if their earnings go up, they pay more. If their earnings go down, they pay less. It's sort of a buffer against shocks to earnings. In the U.S., it's a fixed payment over 10 years. And it's the first 10 years after college when people's earnings tend to be quite low. So it's not a good setup. And we have, even with people who have quite small loans, you see them not paying and going into default, which damages their credit. So this is an enormous public policy issue, and the ratio of evidence to public policy relevance is very sadly very low. Right? So we're trying to get more evidence on loans and their effect. Last, a couple of little findings here. Also, I showed you those tuition prices going up quite rapidly. So one concern has been that the government grants are driving those prices up. So you subsidize something, you can see the firm deciding to raise the price because they can. Not much good evidence on this, and that's because our schools are not for-profit maximizers, except for those 10%, right? They're public institutions or nonprofit institutions. So we do see in the for-profit sector that there is a relationship. Increase the grants, and there is an increase in price. Not so much, however, at the public institutions that enroll 80% of students. We see some evidence that when grants go up, the private institutions give less of their own aid. So they increase their net price a bit to offset what the government gives them. So, we have complicated relationships to think about in terms of one part of government is setting the price, or a private party is setting the price, another part of government is subsidizing it, and we can end up with some unintended consequences in terms of the prices that people face. And that is my last lesson. What time is it?